Thanks for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate that. I'm always thrilled to have an opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing over at the Reece Museum. And I'm really appreciative of this platform and the opportunity to speak at the Women on Wednesdays lecture series. Yes. So I tend to think of myself, and I feel this personally because I tend to think of myself as a woman first, and then from that perspective to think about how I'm doing my work or experiencing my life. And I was introduced to the work of Linda Nochlin by one of my museum colleagues. She was a feminist art historian who wrote what was considered to be a groundbreaking article in 1971 where she described the way women are presented as, quote, the maverick she instead of the presumably neutral or hidden he. And so as I have, gotten more involved in the art world and also through my work at the museum, I just kind of love leaning into this idea that just by being myself, I could be considered the maverick she in the world that I'm inhabiting, disrupting the status quo, usually accidentally. So, the project that I'm going to talk to you about today began when I started to wonder why I felt so different, why I didn't feel like I saw myself represented, and I had trouble communicating my approach outside of the museum world. And for a few years, I really struggled to develop a language around a practice that feels natural, intuitive, and organically formed when I'm just kind of in my work world in the museum. I'm not a trained art historian. And before my current job, I hadn't really had a lot of practice explaining how to look at art. It's still not my best skill set. However, as a person with a soul, I have always understood how to feel art, and even more importantly, how to let it change me. Okay. So I've always been interested in my ancestors, and I would say I came into my current profession through my training as the eldest daughter. Eldest daughters are often the keepers of our family history, and my eldest daughter is the fifth in an unbroken generational line. So I feel that that energy and that way of experiencing the world is really strong for me. Ever since I was a little girl, I knew I wanted to time travel and find personal meaning in the lives and experiences of the people that came before me. So a few years ago, I got very into genealogy. I started researching my family lines pretty far back. And I worked with some elder women who sort of taught me how to access materials and proper ways to do these things. And I was repeatedly warned that I'm probably going to find out things that I might wish that I didn't know. So it's very likely when you look into your family's history that you're going to find evidence that your ancestors did awful, terrible things. And there's a lot of overlap and metaphor here for how museums interpret and exhibit difficult histories. If we think of the museum's collection as representing our collective ancestors, then our approach to materiality leads us to think carefully about how we're currently building our collection and how we're deciding what to exhibit and who to platform in museum spaces. What we collect and display says a lot about us. So, this work, in a nutshell, is about translating an eldest daughter cosmology into a public and institutional realm. Ritual remembrance is a conceptual framework which frames museum interpretation as a series of intentionally designed stories that prioritize material culture as an historical record of equal weight and value to official documentation. Ritual remembrance is generative. It creates a space to reclaim and reconstitute marginalized voices that have historically been erased or excluded from official narratives. And ritual remembrance recognizes that we're really always telling a story about ourselves. Every time I meet a new ancestor through my work at the museum, then I encounter a new part of myself and my personal history. And this piece by Bessie Harvey is one of my kind of inspiration pieces, and it's also one of my favorite things in the collection. If I have to choose one favorite thing, Bessie Harvey was really comfortable with her shadow side, and I think that's why she appealed to a lot of people when she was practicing. She's passed away now, but in the 1990s, she was probably one of the most renowned folk artists in America. She was showing everywhere. But her inclusion in the Reece permanent collection could be seen as disruptive if you look at the museum's collection as a whole. So she's being the maverick she in another format by being included as a Black artist, the Black woman artist in the collection. When she created, her vision was so attuned that she could look at branches, limbs, chunks of wood, and she could see a fully formed art project. She could see it completed. So she would walk out, select something, and take it home, and then create these kind of simplified pieces, which were connected to African Nkisi tradition of building houses for spirits. So she is very connected to um, her own brand of Christianity, which was influenced by African tradition. And her work was often misunderstood by her community. She said that she painted all of her work in this thick layer of matte black to represent evil, and she also warned us that evil often presents itself as beauty. But her community didn't really accept her vision of the world, and they accused her of practicing voodoo. So in the early days, she burned all of her work, which is a total tragedy. So her early work doesn't exist anymore because she felt repudiated by her community for the way that she was experiencing the world. But when I look at Mask, I don't feel any evil or dark associations. To me, Mask feels like springtime, like some communion with nature. And I picture myself in my favorite hiking spots or sitting underneath a big tree. So, as Sammy nicely would tell us, the viewer can become the artist when we really sit with a work or a historical artifact. We listen to what it has to tell us. We can be transformed by a new understanding if we're not afraid of the shadow side or if we're not afraid of what the work wants to tell us. So, to be as successful as she was, she not only reflected the times that she was living in, but as we saw in the previous slide, she was following wherever the soul leads to expose universal truths to her viewers. So Bessie Harvey, a couple of background facts. She was born in Dallas, Georgia, and when people talk about her, they most often talk about her being born in Dallas, Georgia, but she was making her work in Alcoa, Tennessee. So traditionally, art historians have kind of denied her Appalachianness because she was creating her work in communion with her natural surroundings in Appalachia. We have her classified as an Appalachian artist at the Reece Museum. She didn't really begin making art until she was in her late 40s, and she didn't achieve renown until she was well past retirement. So she had kind of a late start. And her work is so incredibly personal. You know, she's transmuting darkness through her work, and she's asking us to come face to face with grief and pain related to racism, to getting married when she was 14 years old, to fleeing an abusive marriage, to overcoming socioeconomic hardships, and to being the single mother to 11 children. So there's a lot of ways I can hear Bessie Harvey's personal story and see her artwork and feel very connected to her. So her artwork really speaks to me. And I like to call this photo assemblage, you got to have a dream to have a dream come true. So, like Bessie Harvey, I was also born in Georgia. My parents both grew up in South Carolina, but all four of my grandparents are from Tennessee. And I never really considered myself to be Appalachian until fairly recently. And I find that I identify most with the idea of the Appalachian diaspora, having spent most of my childhood outside of the region, but always being told that this is where home was located. So I experience Appalachia as a crossroads culture, a place of migration, of coming and going. And I've come to realize that this experience of holding many cultural perspectives is a very valid Appalachian perspective, which in the world of Appalachian studies is considered pretty disruptive. So another example of just being myself, being the maverick she. So from childhood dreams of loving textiles and wanting to wear, beautiful gowns and things like that, at the Reece Museum, I am getting to study these things at a deeper level and sort of come more into contact with the folks who are creating them and learning the stories that are attached to them. And this idea of crossroads culture is very much reflected in the Reece Permanent Collection. And these two dresses are a couple of my favorite things because of, you'll see on the next slide, I won't ruin the surprise, but these two dresses are a couple of my favorite things. The one on the left there, Ida Florence Potter's gown, was made um, sometime right after she moved here. We're having trouble dating this one because it's been changed 3 or 4 times. So it has characteristics of 3 to 4 different fashion time periods, which shows that it was homemade and then it was remade multiple times to sort of keep up with changing fashions. But Ida Potter Harris and her husband, William Pond Harris, moved to Johnson City in 1890 when he founded the Harris Manufacturing Company. And they came here from Pennsylvania, and he was an industrialist who capitalized off of the removal of the old growth forest in the mountains right around Johnson City. It was shipped into Johnson City, and then Harris Manufacturing turned it into hardwood floors, fireplace surrounds, fine furniture, things like that. Um, the gown on the right there, Nancy Unger's wedding dress, is a German day dress, which was used for a wedding in 1843. And you may ask, how do we know this? And that's because Ida Potter Harris recorded parts of her mother's history inside the bodice of her wedding gown, which I think is so beautiful. So this is an example of what I would call movable feminine history. So if we think about how at this time period, because we're talking about very early 1900s, if we think about the time period, how men are memorialized, there's often inheritances like land and money and capital, things that you can materially hold on to. And for women, we might call this the movable feminine history because a lot of times their inheritances were textiles or home goods or things that didn't necessarily have a lot of capital value behind them. And then, as one of my favorite historians, Tia Miles, says, history begins with bodies and artifacts. And in this instance of this movable feminine history idea, locks of hair, woven cloth, or other movable feminine inheritances may preserve the mytho-histories of entire culture groups. So ideas of monumentalization and how we preserve the women's stories in our lives is a big topic, something that we spend a lot of time thinking about when we're looking at this collection that we're caring for. Okay, I'm going to switch gears. Take a deep breath. I get really nervous. Like, you guys are such a kind audience. I don't know why I'm like, let me take a drink. Okay, so that's the introduction to the framework, the way of doing the project. And now I want to give you some institutional context. So, how this is taking place and where it's taking place. So, of course, at the Reece Museum right here behind me. The Reece Museum is classified as a culturally specific museum. We did that at our last reaccreditation. We used to be called Art and History, but we wanted it to be a little bit more integrated. So now we are culturally specific. So everything we're doing is meant to be through the lens of Appalachian studies. So we're looking at Appalachian identity from a variety of perspectives. And we're right here on campus, so we're kind of in this really interesting liminal space where we're a public-facing institution, and we do a lot of work that's really targeted to the outer community, but we have to have an academic foundation because we're also working with our faculty colleagues and trying to get students integrated into our projects. So it's kind of like we have like a foot in each world there. And then our accreditation, we've always been very proud of that. We're one of the first museums in Tennessee to get that, and we just recently got reaccredited last year. So that helps us feel like our standards and our processes and all of the things are in place so that we can do this really good work. So the people that do the work here, there I am up front. And then you probably have worked with Spencer Brenner at some point. He's been here literally forever, over a decade. He's our exhibition coordinator. So he oversees basically anything that goes into the gallery. He'll be the person that you would work with to develop an exhibit and install an exhibit. Then we have Savannah Bennett is our collections manager. Hi, we love Savannah. And she has the job that I previously had. So in 2019, for 2 years, I was the collections manager, and then I moved into the director's position in 2020. So very foundational to what the museum does is what is in that collection. We make a lot of exhibits with it. We do a lot of research projects. And then Ashley Gregg helps us with developing programming, some outreach type things, and she just kind of all around. She does a little of everything. She's wonderful. So fabulous team. And then you see Diddley in the middle. That's our mascot there. And we're very well balanced because Savannah and I both identify as public folklorists, and Spencer and Ashley are both coming to us from the world of fine arts. They both are alumnus of the fine arts department. And what is a folklorist, you may ask? Well, I don't know. I just like this meme. It doesn't really give you any information, so I'm a memer. So public folklore in public folklore in Appalachia is an academic discipline. A lot of people sort of conflate the idea of folklore with folk tales, and of course, telling the stories is a big part of the process, but folk tales and folklore are not exactly the same thing. And then, you probably all know this, but I give this presentation to outside community groups, so I'll just go ahead and go through it with you. But folk culture describes something that's kind of like grassroots up. So when I'm talking about myself as a folklorist, sometimes I think of it as being a subversive historian, because rather than going to the official documentation, I'm much more interested in the firsthand personal experiences of people to tell those stories. And so that involves a lot of oral history collection. So along with the artifacts that we're collecting, we are also collecting the stories and the oral histories that go with them. Because why do we keep all these things? If you don't understand the importance of them and how they fit in and what is the reason for preserving them, then it doesn't make sense to preserve them. So that goes hand in hand with the way that we practice it. And then a really important part of that is treating those artifacts as a historical document. So, I mean, we're not joking when we say equal weight and value. So we really value the materiality of our history, and we use those things to tell the stories. So this is just a little capsule lit review. So these are some of the books that really inspired me. The bell hooks, Art on My Mind, was really important in helping me kind of find my voice and find ways to talk about this work that I haven't seen in other spaces. Tia Miles, this book, All That She Carried, she takes one artifact and turns it into an entire book. She looks at this one artifact from so many different perspectives and tells this huge story based off one textile. I was so impressed with that book. And then Decolonizing Museums has been around for a long time, but it's really foundational in this idea of the maverick, the disruptive type way of doing museum work. And then Social Life of Stories is where I got a lot of the language that I was using in the earlier part of the presentation. And then these other ones are important as well, but I won't go through all of them. So along with these materials, I'm at the museum every single day, and I have access to all of our policy documents, our historical records, our photographs. So I just go through all that stuff and read everything. So I've helped, redo a lot of the policy. So a lot of that stuff is kind of coming from these foundational older texts, so I've studied them intensely. And then part of the accreditation process is to really tell the history of the institution. So I feel like a bit of an expert on the Reece Museum at this point. So all that to say, all of these things together is where I'm getting kind of the methodology behind what we're trying to make sure we're being very intentional about at the museum. Now, the museum itself wasn't dedicated until 1965, but the collection that the museum houses has been part of the university since 1928. So we have almost a century of collecting to look at. So looking at that as a whole continuum, as groupings of what we were collecting when, tells us a whole lot about what was important to us, what our values were, what stories we were choosing to tell at the time. And this is the Reece Museum, circa 1920s. You can see a little streetcar. So we're looking just on the other side of Nick's in the old days there. And this is just another piece of evidence that the Appalachians are a gateway. I know when I go to Appalachian studies or I hear people talk about the region from my field, There's a lot of focus on being up in the hills and hollers and being on the family property and staying in one place for generation, but it's just as valid to come and go from this place. It's always been that way. And then, of course, I always have to point out that this is indeed a personal story for me. That's my granny, right there in the middle, Margaret Jane Hicks, who graduated from ETSU in 1933 and was a public school teacher for 40 years. So I feel very connected to the history of the museum and the collection and the university through all these varieties of ways. So, one of the pieces of museum kind of field-wide history and gallery spaces is this idea of the white cube. For a long time, galleries were painted stark white and things were displayed without any context. And this is called the formalist perspective. So, in the formalist perspective, we're meant to just look at the object based on how it's made and what it looks like without knowing very much about the context and just appreciate it for beauty's sake. But a lot of that started to change, and the counterpoint to that is contextualist. So this is the old collection. So this is the Reece Museum Gallery A. So when you first walk in the entrance doors, now you would see a desk. But used to be that was a gallery. So this is the gallery space in the Reece Museum from about 1965 until 2011. And everything was very white and very bright and very kind of sterile in that space. And then kind of contrast that with the downstairs space, which was the Tennessee Frontier Room. And these artifacts were on continuous display from about 1928 until 2007. And they were arranged in this kind of living history situation. So you come in and you could look in the cabin, and the dishes are set up, and the bed is there, and there's tools laid out. And it was meant to give you more of the context for the use of the artifact rather than just the form of the artifact. And then in the Reece Museum's history, all of this really started to change in the 1980s when we became part of the Center of Excellence for Appalachian Studies and Services, which is how we kind of got here to where we're culturally specific. So that gives you the quick history. So because we have this designation as being Appalachian, when we get visitors who come to us from outside the region, they usually come with a really specific idea of what we're going to be exhibiting and what the gallery space is going to look like. A lot of that can be attributed to the statewide tourism commercials. I can't forget the word. The Tennessee Department of Tourist Development is in Nashville, and so they have this kind of cohesive advertising campaign about this region specifically. So when you're traveling into East Tennessee on the interstate and you stop at the Welcome Center, it looks like a log cabin, and you go inside and there's quilts and lots of old tools and lots of rusty metal. And so when people come to the Reece Museum, a lot of times they'll say like, well, where's the Appalachian stuff? Because we don't have a moonshine still or a coverlet on permanent display. And so when people come in, sometimes they're not really sure how what we're doing is connected to Appalachian culture. So um, as we're developing what we're putting into the exhibits, we are trying to create an experience for people. So in order to experience this kind of ritual remembering, when you come into a space, you want to feel transported. You want to feel like you're time traveling. You want to feel like you're going into another state of consciousness. So as we're developing our exhibits, that's kind of what we're thinking of. We're trying to figure out how to stage the artifacts, how to arrange the exhibit in such a way that you can encounter the ritual remembrance. And this is an exhibit that we did a few years back about the Old Deary Inn and Museum, which is in Bluntville. And if you look in the back corner there, you'll see a dress. Anytime I'm involved with an exhibit, there will be a dress. I can promise you that. And then, I don't know if you've ever hung out with reenactors, but reenactors are fascinating people, and I've taken tons of photos, but I just love the hobnail boots and, sitting around the campfire and cooking in the Dutch ovens. And then we participated, my kids and some of my friends, in some reenactments at Tipton Haynes. So, you know, any chance I can get to wear a costume and traipse around in a historical house, I will sign up for it. And then this is another exhibit that I was part of from a few years back, Suffrage in Southern Appalachia. You can see the dress. There's Mildred in the back corner. And this exhibit included a lot of artifacts from the Harris collection. So the two dresses that we were looking at a bit ago, a lot of the fine furnishings, the examples of embroidery and sewing, and then some of the hats and gloves and things like that came from that Harris collection. And this was an exhibit where I had to be really creative because we wanted to do an exhibit about suffrage, but we didn't have anything in the collection that was specifically related to the topic or about that. So basically, I just used anything we had in the collection that was from the time period to sort of set the stage to tell the story that I wanted to tell. And so we wind up doing that kind of creative work quite a bit with our collection because we have a lot. There's 22,000 pieces in our collection. And because we've gone through all of these different kind of iterations of what our institution does and who, what we're collecting, if you can imagine it, we probably have one. But if you go to another museum, they're really specific. For example, Bardo in Western Carolina, they only collect art made between 1960 and now. That's all they collect. Well, we have everything. We've got tons of stuff. And so you can just see kind of a few of the things that we happen to have in the collection from that specific time period in this exhibit. And then, of course, the dress. So this is an album that we have in the Reece Permanent Collection. And the lady in the middle there is Mildred Smith. So we named the character here, the dress, Mildred. And you can see that we styled her using the photo. So if you kind of look at the shirt waist and skirt and kind of how they're fashioned, we used that as inspiration and pulled pieces from the collection to create something that looked like what she would wear. And then in the background, you can see a mural that was painted by Ellen Elms to further tell the story, because this was something that we hadn't researched and nobody really had previously known too much about. And so now we have these exhibit materials. There's a mural downtown that tells this story. So it was a huge project. The whole community was participating in telling this story. It was really fun. And then, of course, we have a lot of students. So this has always been a teaching collection. Everything that was established at the Reece Museum has been with the hope that students would come in and do research, learn museum skills. We have an organization where we send our students to professional conferences and let them present on the work they're doing. We try to help them network. So we have all kinds of student staff. This is Margaret, and you can see her working with the gowns, so they get hands-on practice in our collection spaces with the artifacts. So there's not too many teaching collections of this nature in the world. So we're really lucky to have this resource for our students. And then thinking about community grief, this was kind of an experimental project we did in 2020. At the beginning of the pandemic experience, we put out a call for art, and we purchased artwork from 40 local artists. So it allowed us to support the artists in our network financially, and then to also document in real time what people were kind of emotionally experiencing during that shutdown phase. And so we've had this collection since 2020, but then once we started venturing back out into public in about 2021, we had the first exhibit of the work. And this was a really meaningful moment to be in a social group setting and to sort of acknowledge that we all had felt this kind of sense of loss and this big sense of change. And that can be really healing when you do that as a community. And that's one of the things that we really hope we're doing with our work at the museum, is creating these spaces where we can have community gatherings like this. And then another way we've sort of branched off and we've disrupted the old way of collecting is to really evaluate what's missing in the collection. And there had been previously not many representations of Black Appalachian artwork in the museum's collection. So Sammy Nicely was an artist in residence and was connected with the museum since the 1980s. And he passed away in 2015, shortly after that last photo was taken there. And he bequeathed 50 pieces from his collection to the museum. And from there, we've built it to over 200. And so when we're talking about Bessie Harvey and some of these connections we have to African artifacts, a lot of that comes from the work we've done with understanding Sammy Nicely and his collection. And this is what it looked like when his work first came into the museum before it was accessioned. You can see it was a treasure. Um, and then over the years, we've done a few exhibits with this collection. The first one was back in 2023. And about 80 of the pieces, about 80 of the 200 and something pieces were in that exhibit. And then um, this is the quote I was mentioning earlier. So this is just a detail of the exhibit. And then there's Sammy holding his mask. And I really, that's the first time I really thought about that. You know, the point is to interpret the work through your own reality. So that was kind of a new concept to me when I first read this quote by him. And then last year, we revisited the collection with an outside curator, and now this exhibit is at the Rose Center, which is where the From Africa to Appalachia Foundation originated, and they're having their 50th anniversary this year. So we're now sort of starting to branch out and travel our exhibits outside of the museum, which is a very exciting thing for us to attempt. And then I want to ask how you feel about time because I want to just chat and have questions, but I also can like dive into my current research project and talk all day. So let me just ask if you have like can we just discuss? You have any questions? What do you think? No? Yes?
I am curious how they wrote.
The bodice. It looks like walnut ink with a fountain pen. Yeah, very skilled. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? I can keep talking. Well, how am I on time? Oh, do I? Okay, well, let's go. Okay. Okay, I went faster than I always get nervous and go faster. Okay. I don't have too many photos on it. Okay, so this is in progress. Now, this quilt is part of a collection that came into the museum in 2007. And there's this quilt, a second quilt, then there's a mother and baby binding, which is a cloth that goes around the belly of the mother, and then there's also one that goes around the baby of the belly's baby. So there's a little teeny one for the newborn baby, and then a binder which contains photocopies of birth records, almost 300 of them. So this quilt first came to my attention about maybe 3 or 4 years ago when we loaned it to William King Museum because somebody was doing an exhibit called "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" They were looking at death and birth traditions in Appalachia. And so because this quilt is associated with a midwife, because of the birthing records and the bindings, we loaned this for that exhibit. And since then, it's been requested to come out and be seen several times. So then I took it to the Quilt Alliance gathering in Jonesboro, and it was looked at by some experts on regional quilting. And when I had it at that event, Mary Kay Waldvogel, who is kind of like the eminent quilting expert in our region, she was reading the names and we were talking about it and looking at it. And she said, well, somebody should find out who these people are. Like it was just the easiest thing in the world. Like it would take 5 minutes to do that. so, and so I heard her say it and I was like, that's crazy, and I didn't think too much about it, but it stayed in the back of my mind for a year or two. And then the quilt came back out at our Spark community gathering, which is a monthly event we hold for people who have Alzheimer's and their caregivers. And Savannah was talking about the quilt and she was reading the names out and she started reading some of the names and I was like, that sounds really familiar. Like there's a couple of names in there where I was like, I don't know why, but I'm like, I felt my spidey senses were, the hair on the back of my neck. I was like, I think I know some of these people maybe. So I got into my ancestry.com account. It started with what I knew about the quilt, which is basically nothing. It came to us from, yeah, It came to us through a master's student who did an exhibit about feed sack quilts. And she had collected these through her connections at her church in Sevier County. And she told us the story that came with this is that it was made by a midwife and that the names on here are the mothers and the babies. So, yeah, so everybody, it's what everybody says. Like, it's super interesting. It's a very compelling story. So that's why it gets shown all the time. Um, so we only had her married name. So she was Mrs. W.C. Williams, which is her husband, because that's how women are represented in historic documents. They're just their husband with the Mrs. And then we had her daughter's name, who is Dovey Williams. And so with Dovey's information, I was able to track her down because I knew she was in Sevier County and I knew she was, born maybe like 1912, 1913, based on what the donor told us. And then I found out that her mother's name, the midwife's name, was Llewellyn Williamson. So then from there, I was able to recreate or to create and figure out her family tree. And a year and a half in, I have almost 6,000 people in that family tree because I'm a little bit obsessive, right? So I've been just kind of crawling through the records. And the reason I've been able to do all of this too is because of that binder with the birth records. Because in the birth records, you have the mother's name with her maiden name, which is so important. And then you have the father's name. Then you have a geographical location. So with that, you can find almost anybody. So I'm getting really deep into it. I'm up to my neck in names and trying to understand it and like see it mentally, have like a mental picture. And I keep reading and reading and looking. I keep running across this lady's name, Ruth Matthews. So Ruth Matthews, she got the headstone laid for the Revolutionary War veteran, and she's the person you call if you need something and you are doing genealogy work in Sevier County. And I started to think like, I think I know somebody named Ruth Matthews. So I text my dad and I said, "Do we know somebody named Ruth Matthews?" He's like, "Oh yeah, that's my cousin." So he gave me her number and I called Ruth and went out to Sevierville and met with her several times. I've recorded quite a few interviews with her. And the first time I went, I met with her and she took my dad because she wanted my dad to come too. And she took my dad and I out into Sevier County and told us how to go. We drove all over the place, finding these old cemeteries where our relatives are buried because one of the names on here is Pearl Baxter, and my grandmother was Margaret Baxter, and her great grandmother and my dad's great grandfather married. So that's how. So they're second cousins, and she's like an expert on where everybody's buried and all the genealogy. So she told me that based on where this quilt was made, so this was made in the Rocky Flats community, which is on the northern border of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and it's kind of sits on the boundary between Sevier County and Cott County. And so basically, if the name is on the quilt, then most likely I'm related to them. So what I'm finding is that all of these people are my family. This is my kin that I've just kind of stumbled on in the collection. Isn't that wild? So yeah, so that's like that first slide where it's like follow where the soul leads. It was like I just heard the quilt and heard the names and just knew this was something I needed to look further into. The spidey sense. Yeah. So I've been able to make a connection with the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Collections Preservation Center. And that's Llewellyn is in this photo here. She's in the back with her hands on the shoulder. I believe that's her in the back. So this is the midwife. And my cousin, she wants me to call her Aunt Ruth. She's like 92. So Aunt Ruth said that probably this was what they call a signature quilt or a friendship quilt. And it was probably made as a gift for the baby catcher. And so that's what she called her, the baby catcher. So I'm still kind of in early days with like trying to figure out what my conclusions and all the themes and all of that are. But I've learned so many fascinating things about birthing traditions and how the community supported women who were giving birth. And something incredibly interesting that turned up with this research is that my grandparents were living in the community where Llewellyn was delivering the babies at the time she was delivering the babies. And she didn't deliver my aunt, she had the baby at the hospital, but my grandmother was having the same people come and support her after the birth. So the midwife comes and delivers the baby, and then another neighbor comes and stays for 2 weeks, and the mother does not get out of bed. And so these, all of these babies, like the women, she probably held my aunt, it's just so crazy. So, so, what else? I'll show you this is how crazy I am. So right now I'm printing out the names of the people on the quilt, and then I'm locating photographs and locating information about them, and I'm trying to develop some sort of map to help me organize it because it is an enormous amount of information. And I've also found that the Smoky Mountains Preservation Center has a lot of oral history. So I've been able to read Llewellyn's voice describing how she would walk through the neighborhood and how she visited the families to deliver the babies. This is also very connected to moonshining, which I kind of didn't want to go in that direction, but everything I'm reading and then the stories my aunt is telling me is that, Cobb County was like the moonshining capital of the world. So this kind of affinity I have for that diaspora and for that crossroads vibe is there's this connection with Chicago. So a lot of the people who were known moonshine distributors were spending time in Chicago, and families were moving up there and living for a time and then coming back. So that's a really interesting line of inquiry. We have a painting that we just accessioned from a Cott County artist where he has made like a pictograph of moonshining history. So there's an oral history that's been turned into visual art. This is a Reverend Jimmy Morrow piece we just got that gives the history of moonshining in Cott County. And I've located some of the names that he put on the painting as people who are in this family tree and connected to this quilt. Um, Another really fascinating turn of events is when we've been out at Bewley's Chapel, which was Sammy Nicely's home church, doing some work about community history and having people bring in documents and kind of helping to collect and preserve some things. And I learned that there was a member of the church called Luther Proffitt, which is the same name as my grandfather. So this is when I was talking earlier about how it feels like I meet new ancestors through this work. I've discovered a whole branch of my family that I didn't know existed just by kind of going out into the community and listening to stories and knowing a little bit about genealogy. It's been fascinating. I could talk all day about this, but yeah. What do you think? That is a good question. So, the person who collected the quilt, who showed it at the museum back in the early 2000s and then donated it, she said it was a feed sack quilt, but I have recently taken it to another quilt group meeting, and everyone agreed it is not feed sack. It's not heavy enough. It's kind of a thin cotton, so it's most likely a Depression era cotton. And it seems to me that people would be bringing in scraps and making those small squares and embroidering their name, and then probably maybe buying special, the fabric that you're seeing in the borders that's all consistent. So it's probably kind of recycled, it's probably a mixture of recycled and then purchased fabric, and it's probably be considered Depression era fabric. This has been ongoing, yeah, because originally we thought these quilts were made in the 1960s, but on closer inspection, there's no way they're that new. They're much older than that. And then the second quilt that I didn't put a picture of on here, after transcribing the names and looking more closely at it, one of the blocks says, "Remember your little friends, 1933." with a name. So probably it's connected to the formation of the Smokies, the park, because most of these folks were in Upper Cosby, which is now inside the park. And so at the time that the quilts were made, this may have been a way of kind of documenting who lived in the community before they all left. Yeah, another like grief. Yeah.